Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of New Books Network. This is your host, Matthijs Lok from Critical Theory Channel. Today, I'm honored to be speaking with Dr. Matthijs Lok about a wonderful book that he published with Oxford University Press. The book is called Europe Against Revolution, Conservatism, Enlightenment, and the Making of the Past. Dr. Matthijs Lok is a senior lecturer in modern European history from the University of Amsterdam. Matthijs, welcome to New Books Network.
Okay, thank you, Matthijs, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor.
Thank you. It's a very, very timely topic, Europe, conservatism, enlightenment. I'm really excited to be speaking with you about the book. Before getting into the book, can you please just very briefly introduce yourself and tell us the story of this book, why you decided to write this book and why you chose this topic?
Okay, thank you, Matthijs. Yes, in my work, I've always been interested in the interconnection between history and politics, the way politics determines history and the way we think about history, and how history also is a topic of politics. And of course, when I started writing the book more than 10 years ago, it was both for us. I saw already there was this development of the rise of the right and the rise of conservatism in Europe, but also, of course, outside Europe as a global phenomenon as well. So I think it was informed by contemporary reflections, but also I noticed that historians hardly wrote about the history of conservatism, anti-liberalism, especially not from an international point of view. So I thought there was something, usually when historians, most of them are progressive, and they write about internationalism or cosmopolitanism, they only see it as a left-wing phenomenon. And I thought it would be interesting to study it from the right as well. So it was both for academic reasons, but also because I thought it was a topical theme. And it turned out to become even more topical as we speak.
And I really like the blurb that is written on the back of the book. So let me phrase this question this way. So nowadays, when you read the news, what you hear is that on the one side, there are people who will say, well, Europe is not what it used to be. They're all these progressive, all these migrants, all these people who are the enemy of Europe and want to break down Europe. Europe is in decline. And they get a lot of that from conservative journalists. On the other hand, there are people who might feel that that Europe has more or less is still a consistent entity. What made Europe was all these cultural exchange from different parts of the world. But this dichotomy between this Europe in decline or this consistent idea of this continent doesn't seem to be a new trend because you kind of trace back this idea back in history. Can you explain about this kind of dichotomy?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but that's one of the interesting outcomes of my book. What I didn't expect, this whole idea of decline, of course, that it's an old trope, this idea that Europe is in decline. It is actually very old. And I noticed that even people in the 18th century, even before the Industrial Revolution and the great industrialization and the phases of neo-imperialism, even then there was already this fear of Europe being in decline. And although, so it's a very old notion. And also of course, the people I studied, they thought Europe was in decline as a result of the Enlightenment, of the spread of Enlightenment ideas, which was losing social structures. So it was mainly, they thought mainly in religious terms, like the rise of Enlightenment, what they saw as the rise of atheism, which was probably not true. But this idea of the Europe in decline is very old. And also what you should notice, there's always a political agenda behind. There's never just the idea of decline. There's always a call for what we should do then, or how can it be solved, or how can this decline be stopped. So it's always a call. So people have been studying or talking about decline, but also about regeneration and ways to regenerate it. And of course, that's what conservatives today are also doing. Of course, they're not just lamenting decline, but they're also proposing a solution. And nowadays, people would say it's mostly about the return of nationalism and the return of the nation state. But it's a very old idea. And also this idea, but interestingly, of course, the period I've been studying, the era of the Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, there were huge civil wars. Mostly when we think about the European wars, we think about the Second World War, First World War, that the Napoleonic Wars were almost as bloody, with almost 5 to 10 million casualties. These were huge wars. So this idea of yearning for peace, but also the people I've been studying, they were also coming up with plans for European communities in many ways. So it's also a very old idea, this idea of European peace, but it's also very different from what later became the EC or the EU. For instance, a lot of Catholics believe that the Pope should unify and rule Europe. So on the one hand, it is an archaeology of ideas of the EU, which are much older than the EU itself. At the same time, the way the ideas they expressed and their analysis is very different from our own era. So that's what I try to do in my book. On one hand, see that these problems and themes are much older, although they also discussed it in a very different way than our own way of doing that.
Mm.
And what's also interesting, for instance, is this idea that those people are nowadays people believe Europe in decline. They often look towards Russia and Putin as a solution for this problem. And interestingly, that's what the counter-revolutionaries of the late 18th century also did. Someone like Joseph de Maistre was a Sardinian diplomat, a very influential counter-revolutionary. He was also a diplomat in Moscow, and he believed that European regeneration also came from Moscow, although he also believed that Russia would become Catholic. Of course, it didn't, and he was kicked out of Russia. But what's interesting, if you want to find all the patterns, this idea that Europe needs to be saved spiritually from the East, you can find that as well already in the people I've been studying at that time.
It's a fascinating idea, and I'm guessing we'll be talking more about that. And whenever I talk with my friends, especially those who just read a piece of news on some website and they come to me and say, okay, well, Europe is in decline. I'll tell them, look, it's not as simple as that. You do need to study history. Then you'll start to see all these trends, all these things that have been happening throughout past centuries as well. One idea that I really like in your book was the concept of historical Europeanism, and you discuss a thinker, Arnold Herrin, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who wrote the Manual of the Political System and its Colonies in 1809. So I'm really interested to know more about this idea of historical Europeanism, what it means, and then it would be great if we talk about Arnold Herrin and his book.
Okay, sure. Yeah, but I found, of course, it's a bit of a cliche that Europe is the old continent, of course, vis-a-vis America or Australia, that's the new world. And what I found interesting that in many ways this idea of Europe as an old continent determined by history is in fact also more or less an invention of these counter-revolutionaries around 1800. I mean, much older Europe would, in the previous centuries, Europe would have been defined in terms of religion as a Christian continent, or in the Renaissance as a humanist culture. But we find in the era I've been studying, the era of the French Revolution, Europe is suddenly above all seen as a continent determined by history. And it's always seen that sets Europe apart, say, from and especially a slow progress in history. And then sets it apart, for instance, for Asia, where, according to those people, that great civilization, but then history went down, or, of course, in their idea, there are countries like continents like Africa or South America, where there apparently was no history. Of course, it's all a fiction, but that's what they believe. They believe that Europe was the result of a very slow and gradual development, and in many ways, it slowly, gradually developed. So this idea of Europe as an historical continent is not that old, and in many ways, what they said, for instance, that the counter-revolutionaries, that the French Revolution destroyed this slow progress. This Europe was a very system of institutions, of ideas, of cultures, which had been developing over centuries, and it was the French Revolution by destroying all those institutions. It also destroyed history, and that's one of the things they objected to, that the French Revolution was seen as an interruption in time. It was an interruption in time when the slow progress was halted and suddenly civilization collapsed as a result of the revolution. At least that was their argument, of the people I've been studying. And well, the guy you mentioned, Arnold Herrin, for instance, is a professor at the University of Göttingen, and he wrote a book about the European state system. And of course, when he published it in 1809, the Napoleonic Empire was at its height. And what he believed, that this state system there's not just one, of course, that's what Europe sets Europe apart, that it's not one empire, but a collection of smaller and medium-sized states. And he said, well, this slowly developed state system, which has been developing over centuries, suddenly was destroyed by Napoleon, by this universal empire. And he compared it to the Roman Empire as a very despotic empire. And when he published his book, he said, well, it was a story of decline, this idea that the state system had been destroyed by Napoleon. But of course, then Napoleon himself, the empire came to an end, and we had the Vienna Order. And of course, the Vienna Order is also a system of various greater and medium-sized powers. And then suddenly his book it was no longer about the past, but it was also a blueprint for a future order. So that was the idea. I said, well, what makes Europe unique? That was a little bit the myth, is that it's not the universal empire as the Chinese or the Islamic empires or the Russian Empire, but that's a commonwealth of states working together, where power is moderated, where there's no despotic power, where there's a common community. And of course, this is also a political myth, but that was the myth that was being developed by the people I've been studying, such as Arnold Hering.
And there was this another.
But I think also interesting to add, Heren, for instance, was originally an ancient historian, and this whole model of the European Commonwealth was actually modeled on the ancient world. He first wrote about the ancient Mediterranean and the ancient world, and he used his ideas about this interconnected world of the ancient world. He used it for his idea of the modern European state system. But over to you, Matthijs.
This another thing that I wanted to ask is this whole idea of enlightened European history, because part of the argument in your book is that it's an idea that is established by historians. So I'm interested to know how and why was this concept of modern Europe adapted by French revolutionaries, people like Nicolas Bonneville, that you discuss in the book.
Yeah, but what's interesting, of course, what happens in the 18th century, there's more or less a general idea. Europe is seen as the Enlightenment idea as the result of a slow progress, as a stadial progress. History is progressing, and Europe is the end of this historical development, especially the commercial societies in Western Europe. And what I found interesting when I studied is how this idea of Enlightenment became polarized. At the end of the 18th century, the 18th century was an era of culture wars, much as we have today. A culture wars between revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. And what was interesting that this idea of Enlightenment is being claimed by different parties. On one hand, we have the revolutionaries who said, the revolution is the culmination of this enlightened progress. On the other hand, the people I have been studying, the counter-revolutionaries said, no, Enlightenment, the right kind of Enlightenment is being destroyed by the revolution, because they're only destroying institutions, not building. And this was not what I expected. When I started out writing the book, I was thinking these are all counter-Enlightenment figures. I thought these were only people who were against the Enlightenment, against the ideas of progress, individualism, reason. But then, as I progressed through the book, I started to notice that people I've been studying not only were objecting to the Enlightenment, but also adopted it for their own purposes. So one of the outcomes in my book is that there's also, you can have a conservative. Enlightenment is not just for a progressive agenda, it can also be used for a conservative agenda as well. So that was so what I was trying to do in my book, I tried to do many things, maybe too many. But what I tried to do that is that Enlightenment ideas can also be used for a conservative and counter-revolutionary agenda. And maybe that's also the case today. For instance, in the Netherlands, the radical right PVV party who now owns the government, or the Rassemblement National in France, those are not parties who reject the Enlightenment, but always claim something uniquely European, and that it's especially Islamic migrants who threaten this Enlightenment culture. So it's interesting also to see the radical right is they're not just perfectly religious. They're often, but they just claim the Enlightenment is something uniquely confined to Europe. You cannot export it, and it's being threatened by mostly Islamic migrants.
It's quite interesting you mentioned that idea, because you're absolutely right that even progressive enlightened progressive ideas of enlightenment have been hijacked by the conservatives. And again, maybe even on a different level, yes. in the United States.
They do this too in the 1800s.
Yeah. And even in the United States, it's funny that how most conservative people always complain about how liberal ideas are under threat. But as a matter of fact, they're not even liberals themselves when it comes to domestic politics or issues such as sexual orientation, LGBTIQ. They're the most anti-liberal people. But when they talk about some economic programs or talk about migration, they always turn into defenders of liberalism or liberal values.
Yeah.
Whereas,
That you see in Europe too, especially in Western Europe, in France or other countries or in the Netherlands, they often claim, the far right claims not to protect the Enlightenment, but they seem to be claim to be defenders of it, of this idea of secularism. And I think that's one of the conclusions of my book, how counter-revolutionaries also use the Enlightenment. At the same time, they were also criticizing it. They also said, well, you have the right kind of Enlightenment, but there's also a wrong kind of Enlightenment, which is the French Enlightenment, which is secular, atheist, individual, is destructive. And the right kind of Enlightenment, it's about moderation, about slow, about progress, but in a wider context of history and religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And now let's speak a little bit more specifically about these enemies of the Enlightenment. You talk about this character, Francois Xavier de Villers. So I'm interested to know, why was he against Enlightenment? Who was he? Why and how he was against Enlightenment? How he considered Enlightenment to be a danger to his ideology?
Yeah, François Xavier de Villers was from the southern Netherlands. He's quite interesting. He's quite a nasty character, actually. I don't think I would like him. But for him, it was interesting. He saw the Enlightenment as a great threat, especially to the church. And he believed that the spread of these Enlightenment ideas would destroy Europe and would destroy all institutions, would make sure that people no longer would believe in the church, but would no longer obey their fathers, would no longer obey the state. And he saw this as a great threat. And he spent his whole life fighting his ideas of Enlightenment. He wrote every day, I think he wrote tens of pages. He published thousands, I think more than 20 or 30,000 pages, fighting what he saw as the evil Enlightenment spirit. But I found interesting for two reasons. First of all, he was also very international. That's something what's interesting. Very wide networks. He used to be part of the Jesuit order, which was is the connection still fine, Matthijs?
Yeah.
Okay. So he was part of the Jesuit order, which was dissolved, and he saw this as an example of the spread of Enlightenment. But he was also very international. He had these very international networks. He often traveled around Europe. He had friends in Hungary, all around the place. He wrote in French. He wrote to many other people. So he was a conservative, but also very international one. And secondly, he not only fought the Enlightenment, but he also adopted the instruments of the Enlightenment, for instance, journals, the way he wrote the same kind of books or dictionaries. He wrote a lot of dictionaries. He also hid his ideology in the form of, say, historical dictionaries or geographical dictionaries. So on the one hand, he fought the Enlightenment, but he also copied the means, and he also copied the instruments of the Enlightenment. So there's a certain duality there and ambiguity, which I find interesting. But that's what we see today too, that of course conservatives are not only objecting to liberals, but also in many ways adopting their means and their instruments as well. Mm-hmm. And so on one hand, but he's a nasty character. For instance, he defended slavery, but he said that with an Enlightenment argument, he said it's in the interest of the enslaved that they stay. That's in their best interest. They have a much better life than they would have had in Africa. So in many ways, you can also use Enlightenment arguments to defend slavery, like an horrendous cause such as slavery. And he says he used the Enlightenment. He said, well, it's in the best interest of all of us, and it works better for the enslaved people. So it's also interesting to study people who defend slavery and how they do that, and also that you can use the Enlightenment to defend this kind of horrible causes.
As you mentioned, I guess there's this dark side of Enlightenment that is not really talked about a lot, and unfortunately,
yes, that's one of the things I try to do. So I'm not quite sure Enlightenment scholars will like my book, but they probably will not, because it shows them sides which they often don't like to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's our job as historians. That's what you should do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there has been some writing about the dark side of Enlightenment when it comes to slavery and how and racism, how they racially profile people of Africa, for example. But when it comes to political ideas, it's mainly taken to be something progressive. But in the past few months, I've been reading several books, especially your books, that kind of shed light on the other conservative side of Enlightenment values. And again, just on that topic, while we're on that, when it comes to the idea of revolution in the 18th century or conservatism, Enlightenment, Edmund Burke is a character that is usually discussed. But again, one of the things I liked about the book is that you introduce lots of different characters. One of them was Xavier Defoe. And the other one, who was a friend of Edmund Burke that I'm interested to know more about, is Charles Alexander de Calonne. I'll leave you to correct the pronunciation.
Yes.
So who was he, and how did he use the idea of a European history for his counter-revolutionary purposes? And was he a moderate, or how do you categorize?
So what I try to do, most books about these topics are usually from about one person or from a national perspective. And I try to use different persons from different perspectives. It was a lot of work because they all travel around, and their nationalities in our meaning don't really exist. But my chapter on what I wanted to do with my chapter on Alexander de Calonne, who was a former minister of Louis the 16th, who fell out of grace, that he migrated to Britain and also other countries, and also Burke. Burke is seen a little bit in isolation. He's often by conservatives seen as the father of conservatism. We know that's not true. He would probably never describe himself as a conservative. But also what I try to do, I put him a little bit outside. Of course, British scholars always tend to think as British history as sui generis, and I try to show that Edmund Burke is part of a much wider, larger environment of people who had similar ideas. And as I said, Calonne and Burke, and interestingly, Burke was very active in the reception of refugees from the continent. Those were all counter-revolutionaries. It's interesting also that many of these counter-revolutionaries were refugees. They were migrants. They sought asylum. So many of the asylum seekers of this era are nobles and counter-revolutionaries, and not an entirely different type of migrants as we actually think about today. But they were very active, and I would try to show that many of these ideas, Edmund Burke, he collaborated with people from France, from other countries. So it was not something uniquely British. And I called this chapter Crusaders for Moderation because they both claim to be moderates. That's really important. But what's interesting, of course, that moderation was also had a very political cause. They tried to use moderation against the revolution, many in a way like maybe, again, and I always make comparisons to the present, someone like Macron or Ursula von der Leyen also see themselves as defenders of moderation against the extremes. And I'm interested in the topic of moderation because there's always a political agenda behind it. And this is the agenda of people like Burke and Calonne. They claim to be moderates, but they also use it for a specific agenda. But what I found interesting, someone like Calonne, he was traveling around. And many of the people I've been studying, as I said, they were traveling around Europe. They often were fleeing for the revolution. They traveled around. They were also cosmopolitans despite themselves. They didn't want, this is not the life they wanted, but it was forced upon them by the circumstances. Someone like, they probably would have had very quiet, boring lives when they were born 50 years or 20 years earlier. But they were born now, and they had to leave, they had to travel around, and they had to start writing about it. So it's also a little bit the accidents of being born at the time of great turmoil and revolution and war, which turned them into writers and intellectuals and made their lives more important. But as I said, the whole problem of asylum migration has a very different character in this era, that mostly about nobles and people on the right who opposed revolution rather than progressives, as we nowadays tend to see migrants and refugees.
Well, that's a irony of history. I guess that's
yes. It's why it's so useful to study history. It gives different perspectives.
Exactly.
Our predicaments. Yeah.
Exactly. Let's move to Germany now.
Yes.
So how was the idea of Europe as a pluralist continent? This idea, I guess, developed in Germany by German theorists. And can you talk about this idea of Europe as a pluralist continent, and then there's another character you introduce in the book, another figure, Adam Muller, and his book, Elements of Statecraft. I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know about that as well.
Yeah, so what I find interesting, especially this idea of Europe as a diverse continent, a little bit is a cliche, but it's also people that invented it. And especially in Germany, this was a very popular idea. In many ways, of course, they were built on the Holy Roman Empire, which was in some ways resembles perhaps a precursor to the current EU in the sense there was not one big power. It was a combination of different larger and smaller states in a highly complicated institutional regime, a little bit like the contemporary EU. And it was especially in Germany, their ideas came to exist that Europe was what makes Europe unique. And of course, we can talk about to what extent this is true. But they said Europe is unique because it doesn't have one center. It has not one political center. It's not an empire. It has not one economic center. It's not one religious center. There's Protestantism, Catholicism. And in fact, this pluralism is not a bad thing. It is something which makes it creates dynamism. It creates freedom. It makes sure that there's not absolute power. And that's what makes the European experience unique. And of course, I think because of the Holy Roman Empire, you see this idea, especially in Germany. Germany is often seen, I've also studied this guy, Niklas Voigt, he's from Mainz, which is a city which was an important city in the Holy Roman Empire. And he said, well, Mainz is the core of Germany, and Germany is the core of Europe. Europe is the core of the world. So they of course saw themselves in their own position where they were as the essence of the universe, of course, as we all do. And I said someone like Adam Müller also had this idea that Europe would make Europe unique. And his idea was this fact that it's a pluralist continent, but he thought it was a good sign. And Adam Müller has had a very bad press. Later in the 20th century, he's seen as a precursor of fascism. But I think what I tried to do in the book is that's something people 200 years later did to him. And if you actually read his work, he's not at all. There's no fascism there. He's in his own way. He's also a cosmopolitan writer in his own way, and he's much more moderate, and he's also using the Enlightenment for his own agenda. But someone like Müller, he had this idea that pluralism is not a bad thing. It creates freedom, diversity, and what makes Europe unique. Well, it's a little bit a myth too, but it's also there's some truth in it as well, as in any successful myth, I suppose. But these are all writers, they're not known anymore. I mean, they're very obscure writers. I mean, I think most people in the book you do not know, do you?
Well, absolutely. That's the point I was making. We only know like very famous people such as Edmund Burke, but the great thing about this book is that it introduces you to a range of different historical figures who were theories and who had important works and who were influential in their own time, but have unfortunately been swept aside. And I guess that's one of the let's say, misfortunes. As you rightly mentioned, like Edmund Burke is known as the father of conservatism, but he never considered himself to be one. And I guess that's part of the misfortune that a lot of these other historical figures are swept aside, and we just come to know a few of them, and we have all these misconceptions about them as well. Another idea is the idea of a European republic, which was introduced by Matthijs Lok. Can you talk about him and the idea of European republic? And I'm also interested to know if he really believed in a European diversity. Did his republic mean a European diversity?
Yeah, so that's interesting. You see in the 18th century also this idea of European republic instead of an empire, that it's all these different, and often you have a lot of books about republicanism, but they're never about the European republic, and it was mostly about the system of institutions. In that sense, it's different than the Republic of Letters, which is more a cultural notion. But the European Republic, as it was used by Enlightenment, was more about institutions, system of institutions, which guaranteed freedom and moderation. What I try to study in my book is how this Enlightenment idea of the European Republic, which was also used by Voltaire and by other Enlightenment writers, suddenly becomes used by these counter-revolutionaries as a way to to attack the revolution. And I study in detail the works of Voigt, which is nobody knows anymore. But he was a professor at Mainz, and he was later actually the teacher of Metternich, who designed the Vienna Order. So in that sense, he was quite influential. And his ideas, I think, through Metternich were also influential. But what I try to do is to show how this idea of the European Republic became even more conservative as the revolution progressed. It became more counter-revolutionary, and you see how this conservative concepts are increasingly becomes conservatives, and puts more emphasis on religion, and that the religious character becomes more important. Also, the idea of hierarchy, that there is a hierarchy of that the men should rule of the women and their families, and the prince over the states. So I tried to you how this concept was a very malleable concept like the European Republic, which started out to be very open, progressive, cosmopolitan, increasingly could also be used for a conservative agenda. That's what I tried to do in the book. And in many ways, I think it's the missing link between the Enlightenment and what later became the Vienna Order. In many ways, this is the original concept on which the Vienna Order after Napoleon, which consists, of course, mainly of a monarchical order of great monarchical states. In many ways, this is the concept linking the 18th century to the Vienna Order, I would say. So, and again, it can be used how open cosmopolitan concept can also be used for a conservative agenda.
Which is kind of a difficult concept to comprehend these days, right?
Yes.
Cosmopolitan and conservative.
Yeah. And also many people, the Vienna Order, I think that's also interesting. It's often seen as a very highly reactionary political system. People like Henry Kissinger were very fond of the Vienna Order. But in many ways, if you studied it, the people who created it believed they didn't see themselves as reactionaries. They saw themselves as bringing peace to Europe. They thought, and of course, over time, this order became highly repressive. Eventually, but the origin, by its origin, its founders believed they were bringing an enlightenment peace to Europe, and of course it turned more reactionary as time went by. But it was not, I think, not as it's designed.
Again, it might not be the right comparison, but I was reminded when I was reading the book and listening to you now, I was reminded even of American conservatives, mainly Austrian economist Hayek or Friedman. Even Hayek, who wrote that book, I think, Road to Serfdom, he didn't consider himself to be a conservative.
No.
Didn't consider himself. Their ideas were, but they didn't really consider themselves conservative. There seems to be something about this word that dispels everybody, right? Even the conservatives, although they are.
Yeah. Now, especially on the European continent, words like very few. Even today, very few, maybe today a little bit more, but I think in the past, people didn't want to be called conservative. There was this very Catholic politician in the Netherlands who said in parliament that he would rather be called an arsonist or a thief than to be called a conservative. And especially in countries, Britain is different, although even there, it's more complicated. But in countries like France, Germany, the Low Countries, the word nobody wants to be called a conservative. That's sort of that's often seen as a negative concept, pejorative concept others use for you. So in many ways, they call themselves moderates. Maybe the way Ursula von der Leyen is doing today, if you call yourself moderate, in between the big, the fanatics on both sides. And of course, there's also a political agenda behind it all, which is usually a center-right agenda.
Yeah. How about Arnold Ludwig Heeren? He was a historian of modern Europe, and who was he, and how did he explain the rise of modern state system in Europe?
Yeah, he's Arnold Ludwig Heeren is actually, it's an interesting figure. He's almost forgotten today. Nobody knows about him. But in his own time, he was quite famous. He was one of the teachers of Bismarck, for instance, but also of Ranke and Göttingen. He had highly influential students. So in many ways, very influential people. He was a guy, he has a very boring life. By the way, he came to study at Göttingen, which is a small city in northern Germany. And he almost spent his entire life there. So his life is very boring. But his ideas are interesting. In many ways, he wrote about the history of the European state system. As I said earlier, he started out as an ancient historian, but then started to write about the European state system. And this idea that there was not just one empire, but that there are many different states working together. And this was a very slow development. The French Revolution was destroyed the state system, but the Vienna Order restored it again. And what's interesting, in his own time, Heeren is no longer seen as an important figure, but in many ways, all theories about the state system, for instance, in the English school, and I think the whole theory of international relations and the state system are derived from Heeren. So it's often forgotten. And Heeren was not a fanatic. He was also, he was a reasonable person, but he was also a conservative and a monarchist. And in many ways, it was a defense of the Vienna Order, this idea that there's this natural order of the major states who work together. Mm-hmm. And so again, he was using the state system was not a neutral idea. It was very much an idea used by conservatives to attack Napoleon or the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. But as I said here, it's one of those names which you no longer know, but in many ways there are long lineages. For instance, in Bismarck, but also in Ranke, the founder of modern historiography, but also in many ways the whole theory of international relations was in many ways derived from Heeren's writings on the history of the state system.
Now, in the book, you discuss Vienna Order. Can you first tell us what was Vienna Order, who were its members, and how did the collapse of Napoleonic order bring about the idea of a European renewal?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the Vienna Order is what came, of course, after Napoleon. I think until 1812, the idea existed that the Napoleonic Empire was to be the end of European history. Even Napoleon himself thought that Europe would be a part of this large Franco-centric empire, which would continue forever. But then, of course, he made the mistake of attacking Russia. And of course his empire fell, which was came to a great shock to many people. Many people didn't expect it. And then, of course, there was the problem what to do next. How shall we rebuild Europe? And the idea was by the victors of the time, that were Britain, Russia, Prussia, also the Habsburg Empire. The idea was, on one hand, we want to go back to what came before. On one hand was a restoration, that there was this system of big powers, of large powers, but at the same time they said we should improve upon it. I mean, this is the 19th century. They also said there has to be some progress. The problem with the 18th century system was that there was a lot of war. Often when there was a conflict, it was solved by war. And now they said, well, the solution today is that let's not make war, let's have diplomatic negotiations. And the idea, and my colleague Beatrice de Graaf from Utrecht University has called this a European security culture. That in the sense that there were all kinds of negotiations between the powers to solve security problems, and especially, of course, the big fear was another revolution, another French Revolution, another era of revolutionary wars. So they negotiated together. And the idea was to get a security system in place. So that was one aspect, security. On the other hand, as I said, it was also a return to monarchical Europe. The French Revolution, and especially the Napoleonic era, had resulted in the collapse of many monarchies. Of course, the Bourbon monarchy had fled to England. Even, for instance, the Dutch House of Orange more or less were refugees in what is today Poland. And many of these old families came back, such as in France and in the Netherlands. So it was a monarchical order, they believed, but it was also an order which tried to, many of these monarchs, they said, we are not going to rule by divine rights, which of course, traditional legitimation for monarchy. But for instance, the Dutch king legitimized himself by bringing economic innovation, and he built a lot of infrastructure like roads and canals. So it was an old system, like a monarchy, but on a new foundation. And for instance, in the Netherlands, the House of Orange said we want to make economic modernization, and we can do that as monarchs. We can bring economic modernization. And also in France, the Bourbon came back, but especially one of my favorite kings is Louis XVIII. He was rather overweight. He was not very athletic. But he was a very good politician. And he said, well, I'm not like Napoleon. Napoleon is a soldier. Napoleon is on a horse, but he has killed millions of people. And I'm more like your friendly grandfather. I'm overweight. I'm not athletic, but I bring you peace and prosperity. So he used his body, I think, very cleverly. And he said, I'm your old friendly father. Let's not talk about the past anymore. Let's look towards the future. And I think it was a very clever way of reinstating French monarchy. So that was the Vienna Order. So again, on one hand, it was a return to the past, but also in a new way. There was more, someone like an historian, Schroeder, has called this a diplomatic revolution that was conflicts were solved by negotiation. And as I said, it started first rather optimistically, this idea of bringing peace. There was a kind of euphoria. Many people from different persuasions really believed that now Europe had achieved peace forever, perpetual peace, as Immanuel Kant called it. Although very quickly, already from 1819, 20s, especially after the so-called Karlsbad decrees, much more repressive policies were in place. And you see that this peace system became much more repressive. And we see all kinds of new opposition movements starting to appear. So there was this short moment of peace, but peace can become very oppressive too. And that's what happened with the Vienna Order. And still today, there are two visions. One, which you can read, a beautiful book by Adam Zamoyski, said, well, it was actually a repressive, reactionary order. On the other hand, there are those like someone like Kissinger, actually, who believed it was not... They say, well, but they did well, it brought stability. You could say that, for instance, the 19th century compared to the 18th century or the 20th century was, at least on the continent itself, less violent. You have less huge wars which kill 1 million people. Others have said, well, they exported the violence to the colonies. So in many ways, they brought peace in Europe by exporting war to the rest of the world. But so those are the two visions on this Vienna Order. And I think it had both. It started out as a peace project. The peace projects can become very oppressive too.
And I guess that's where the whole idea of European renewal comes from, right? Because of the collapse of Napoleonic order.
Yeah, it started out as a renewal. It started out as a regeneration project. And many people believed that now all conflicts were to be solved. There was kind of a euphoria at the beginning, and the idea was all conflicts will be solved, and there will be this great union. And of course, that often happened after wars. It happened after the Second World War. It happened after the 30-year war in the 17th century. There's this short moment of euphoria and reconciliation, and very soon old conflicts reappear, and it's only a moment when this drive for peace. You can read Stella Gervais' book about this too. The short moments of peace, but they always do not last very long.
Pretty much, I guess, like the idea, Fukuyama's idea of end of history and collapse of Berlin Wall. It was euphoria, and then
but there are many
30 years later,
of course, and of course, the whole idea of end of history originally came from Hegel, who thought in 1806 that Napoleon was to be the end of history. And then often people in history have this idea: okay, now history has ended, we're there, but very soon history starts turning again and reappearing again. So in that sense, there's nothing new thinking that an end of history appears.
And that's why I love history, right? Because it gives you perspective into contemporary events.
It helps us to see out of the box. It helps us to see, and also it helps us to see. I think also, people always think that they're living in the most important time ever, and of course that's something people all periods think. And might just help to. Of course, we're seeing things which are disturbing, but in many ways, putting it to a larger perspective might help us to not be overcome by it. And
Absolutely. Now, I'm interested to know, so we've spoken about the idea of Europe, what it meant from different people's perspective. I'm curious to know if the idea of empire was ever discussed by European historians in that time.
Yeah, that's actually, they did talk about it a lot. So that's, I think, interesting. Someone like Arnold Heren, for instance, nowadays, historians think global history is something all the rage and is something very new. But someone like Arnold Heren already put a lot of emphasis on the relationship between the European state system and its empires. And he said, well, increasingly, the colonies have an effect on the state system, and the conflicts between the imperial nations over empires increasingly affect Europe. So this was already an idea people had in this moment. And what I find interesting here, that in many ways, of course, empire, you have the extra-European empires, but also the empires within Europe itself, like the Napoleonic Empire, and like the Russian Empire, so in many ways, nowadays you make a clear separation of empires, which is something outside of Europe, but then Europe itself consisted of empires in that era. And I've been reading reports, for instance, by a French civil servant of the Napoleonic civil servant who came to the Netherlands, and in many ways, the civil servant talked about the Netherlands in many ways as say a Dutch colonial civil servant talked about Indonesia. In many ways, they tried to bring reports on the Netherlands, which was then incorporated by the Napoleonic Empire, like a subject population which were not entirely able to rule themselves. They were a bit like children. So in many ways, this colonial outlook, it was not something which was only outside of Europe, but it also existed within Europe itself too. And of course, at another level, in many ways, we see now that in many ways, the French Revolution is not only seen anymore as a European phenomenon, but also as a global phenomenon. Someone like the case of Haiti, where slaves freed themselves. And nowadays, we are also looking once at this wonderful conference on the restoration in Bogota, in South America. And for instance, that's also a very good perspective to look at the European restoration, not only from a European perspective, but also from South America or from Africa or from Australia, Asia, for instance.
And another idea that I'm interested in is the idea of, so during a romantic period, there was this idea of nationalism. So the notions of historical Europeanism or cosmopolitanism, how did these notions go in a time when we had the rise of nationalism, romantic nationalism?
Yeah, that's one of the interesting, of course, that's one interesting if you're going to look at history. You have to remember that nationalism was mostly a progressive, liberal, revolutionary idea at the beginning of the 19th century. It was revolutionaries which were defending the revolution in the name of the nation. So nationalism was a progressive idea at the beginning of the 19th century. And many of these counter-revolutionaries I've studied, they had quite a cosmopolitan outlook. They were not nationalists. They believed that nationalism was something of the past. They believed it was part of this fanaticism of the revolutionaries. And in many ways, these were more, they had a very European outlook. They were cosmopolitans to a certain extent, because they were also believed in European civilization, and those who were not included in it. But they're not nationalists, and it's only at the beginning of the second half of the 19th century that nationalism becomes an idea of the right, or becomes an idea. People like Bismarck started using it. So in that sense, they were not. They often hated nationalism, and that's interesting. Someone like Joseph de Maistre, who came from Sardinia, had nothing with Italian nationalism, and he disliked it, and that's why. They do not fit in this. And nowadays, of course, people like Orban and others call themselves conservative nationalists. But this is something early 19th century people could never understand. How could you be conservative and a nationalist? That they couldn't have understood that. Whereas today, this is something which is self-evident.
So nationalism was something that was actually celebrated by revolutionaries, but
yeah, that's what they believed in. Yeah,
but they still reconciled it with this European cosmopolitanism, right?
Yeah, and of course, but they often, of course, what you see, what everybody always does is seeing their own region as the core of course but as I said, they didn't believe nationalism is not. They saw it as something of revolutionaries. They saw it as a progressive idea, and that's why they fought it. So that's really so. On one hand, I think there are resemblances between contemporary conservatives and the old conservatives, in the sense they believe they're afraid of corruption, they're afraid of decline, they're afraid that individualism is destroying civilizations. But there are also major differences, and the major difference in this case is the role of nationalism, I would say.
You're a historian, and I always like to end the interviews by asking how you see the future. So, reading your book and talking about it, I'm sure the listeners have appreciated how much similarity there is these days between these heated discussions, these culture wars in Europe about conspiratorial theories such as the Great Replacement theory, migration, and nationalism. But these are not new ideas, and we have had them in the past 2 centuries. Again, in the light of what happened in past week with European election, I wonder how you see these arguments historically developing, and how do you see the future of Europe in terms of such arguments?
Yeah, well, as I said, this moment of polarization, like everywhere else in the world, Europe in that sense, I think is not different from, say, India or South America or the USA or maybe Australia, I don't know. But I think even so, in that sense, it's a much more, people in my era believe that Europe was quite unique and very different. And I think I think in many ways it's similar to other parts of the world. But I think, but the more positive side of my book is, I think that, for instance, those conservatives, they they were the sense that you can unite conservatism with cosmopolitanism. I think that's something that if you want to, as I said, I'm not a big fan always of the people I study. I think in many ways they're scary and I would not use them. But what I liked about them is the way that they could unite. There's some kind of a middle way between cosmopolitanism and your political views. And I think in many ways that's what I like, that you can unite your attachment to a region, to the nation and to the continent, and maybe even wider. So in that sense, it's useful. Well, what can we learn about them? I hope we can learn from the past that there will not be often these times of polarization end in a continent-wide war. So I truly hope this will not be the case, and it remains to be seen to what extent the EU can adapt to these changes. And we already see, for instance, in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, not like Orban attacking EU institutions, but using it for her own aims. So it remains to be seen to what extent the EU and I must say I sort of support the EU. I hope it can function as a protector of rights, and also it might dampen the impact of these far right parties surging. So at the same time, I'm moderately optimistic, because I think the EU institutions are stronger than they were earlier institutions, and also better than say like the Vienna Congress. So I hope it can hold, it can absorb, and maybe also soften the shocks a bit we see now appearing in European politics. So I'm moderately confident, but that maybe I hope we can actually. I hope we have learned from the mistakes and the disasters of the past. So hopefully, but we have the French elections next week, and the far right Rassemblement will probably win them. So we'll see what happens. But I hope the system we designed can absorb this shock, and I'm moderately confident it can.
Great. And we remain optimistic. Open optimism is what we have.
Yeah. And also the talking, that's what I also like, that you can, the fact that we are now conversing via Zoom to the other part of the world, and we can talk about it. And that's something which always makes me optimistic also. And also when my students come from all over the world, and they're really they have all kinds of ambitions and plans. And I must say, teaching students from all over the world makes you also helps you to stay being optimist. But of course, the challenges are great, and also, but I think it's important to listen and try to understand, and not just voice opinions, and not just voice opinions, but also listen what you did.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Matthijs Lok. Absolutely enjoyed talking to you about your book. The book we just discussed was Europe Against Revolution, Conservatism, Enlightenment, and the Making of the Past, published by Oxford University Press in 2023. Thank you very much for your time.